everyone, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel, where today I am bringing you a report on an adventure that I have been on throughout this whole month of October, and I am excited to tell you about it. It's something that I have just done for the first time, and that is a readathon, which is a term that I've been hearing around BookTube ever since I joined a couple of years ago, but I somehow managed to not really know until recently what a readathon actually was. So I'm sure that a lot of you watching this video are extremely familiar with readathons and have done several of them, and others have probably never even heard that word before. So today I'm here with a report for both of those groups on how my very first readathon went and the experience of being in the readathon, but also primarily the books that I read during this time and what I ended up thinking of them. So first of all, a readathon is essentially a reading challenge that a lot of people participate in together and compete in. Usually it's hosted by one booktuber, sometimes by a few booktubers together, and the participants read books based on prompts, where you read a book that fits a certain prompt, and by reading those books to fit those prompts, you advance in the competition. And usually you can choose between a couple of different prompts to move forward so that you're not too constricted, but there is also that challenge element of finding a book that fits into that category that has been suggested, and it kind of helps you maybe read some things that you wouldn't have thought to read otherwise, or expand your reading horizons, or just actually make yourself read what's on your TBR that you have not been getting to recently. So now that I actually understand what a readathon is, I think that's pretty cool because it encourages more reading. I'm always into things that encourage people to read more books, and the community aspect of it is also pretty cool. So I jumped right into this one. I heard the announcement that the readathon was happening, I think the day before it started, or maybe the day that it started. So I just had to jump in with both feet and get oriented as I was going, and that did lead to me starting out a little bit behind. And I had a lot of long books this month, and also just the challenge is pretty rigorous. This readathon was to officially complete the challenge requires reading 10 books in the month, which, I mean, I consider myself a pretty heavy reader, but 10 books in a month is still definitely pushing it for me. So I ended up not being able to complete the last of the challenges. I'm finishing 9 books this month, not 10, so didn't quite make it, so close, but I am very much okay with that. I think 9 books in a month is definitely nothing to be ashamed of. That's my biggest reading month of the year still. So even though I'm not really officially completing this readathon, I still thought that it was a lot of fun. The theme of this readathon, it's called Fablen, and it's Dungeons and Dragons themed choose your own adventure readathon. So there's been a story component to it where the book prompt that you choose determines what your character's response to the scenario in the story is going to be, and the story has had a library and ivy overgrowing things and creepy shadows and magic and elves and a party of adventurers and guilds, and so just a lot of my favorite things have been going on in the theme of this readathon, and that's been a lot of fun. It is hosted by Margaret at the Word Nerd, and I will link her channel down below. She's clearly put so much work into this, and I've just been really impressed by the amount of detail that she and the guild masters who've been helping her have put into this project. I can tell that it just took so much time, so much preparation. Having organized a few events, I'm like, this took so much organization. So I really hope that it's been fun for Margaret and the guild masters as well, since they put so much into this. I think between 200 and 300 people have been participating, so a lot of readers have been doing this, and that's just been really cool. And I hope that a lot of people have read more books this month than they would have otherwise and not gotten too overwhelmed, because in addition to the 10 main quest books that were required to complete the challenge, there have also been a bunch of side quest prompts, so I can't imagine trying to fulfill all of them. Surely no one has done all of them. If you completed all of the main encounters and side quests for Fablen, please let me know, because I really can't imagine, unless you do a bunch of very short books. I know a lot of people were looking for novellas and graphic novels and things like that, which would definitely help. But yeah, so much reading in the month of October, and it's cool to see that much reading happening. I at times felt a tad overwhelmed with all the reading, and as I've already mentioned multiple times now, decided not to complete the last challenge. Just wasn't going to be realistic. But the books that I did read, I liked having that extra encouragement to read, that extra community as I was reading them. So overall, I definitely thought that it was a cool experience. So let's talk about the 9 books that I did read for Fablen. And you will recognize a lot of these if you watched my fall library haul video, which I will put up a card for. This was my excuse to read a lot of those books as quickly as I could. And these books happen to have kind of the classic fantasy theme that ended up really fitting well with the Fablen theme. So that was cool. Not every single book that I read this month fit with that theme, but the majority of them did, so that was kind of fun. The first book that I finished for Fablen was The Rune Lords, which is in my fall library haul video. And I mentioned at the time, when I was about 40% of the way through it, that like I was enjoying it, but also kind of uncertain about some things. So now that I've finished it, I am pleased to say that I did end up really liking it, and it is probably a 5-star read. And it's possible you'll see this one popping up on my top 10 reads of the year video because the magic system is just incredible. I ended up really liking the main characters. The world building is such a cool combination of hard magic and the more soft magic, kind of wonder based world building. I just snagged this one at the library because I saw the title and I saw the author and the cover. I was like, let's go for it. I had no intention of reading the rest of the books in the series, but after I read it, I was like, man, I might have to read the rest of the books in the series. This was not my plan. So, at least book 2, I might give a try and see if the series continues to be good. I really appreciated that even though it is adult fantasy, it doesn't have the same kind of dark pessimism that I see in a lot of adult fantasy. It is not in some ways as complicated and convoluted as some adult fantasy can be. It definitely has a lot of characters, a lot of POVs, a lot of things are going on, but there's a very distinct through line through the whole book that I think carries it along pretty well and makes it a little bit easier to get through than some. The middle was a bit slow, I guess, but I was okay with it because I was invested enough in the characters in the world that I didn't mind just hanging out with them. So, yeah, I really loved this one. And in terms of adult fantasy, it was like all the stuff that I was looking for in adult fantasy that I didn't even know that I was looking for. So, yeah, I just ended up being a really big fan of this one. And it was a good way to start the readathon, except that it was long and I started out kind of behind. The next book I read was Starter Villain, which ended up not being as much what I thought that it was going to be or what I was looking for. There were definitely things about it that I enjoyed. It had a lot of very sharp critique of 21st century stuff from Airbnbs to Zoom meetings to a lot of it was about like bro business culture, which I didn't think was going to be a thing in this, and that did end up getting a lot of the really sharp critique. A lot of it was a lot of it definitely made me laugh. There's a scene where one of the main villains that we deal with is on a Zoom call and trying to figure out how to make Zoom work and how to turn encryption on, and that scene like will just be with me forever because I will never get on a Zoom call again without thinking about this villain trying to make his Zoom conferencing work. So that was great, but overall I felt like the book didn't end up being what I want it to be, largely because it was hard to feel like the villainous characters were really villains because we didn't have any heroes and we didn't really see the victims of the villains. So the idea of them being like these evil businessmen, I guess, but they didn't really feel like villains to me, even though they were clearly bad guys. Just because, yeah, again, there was really no hero to stand up against them, and I didn't really see the people that they were hurting. So it was like, yeah, I guess those are bad business practices, but we're just not seeing the damage that it's causing. So I felt kind of disconnected from that. It probably doesn't help that I was thinking more like fairy tale or legend villains, whereas these are more like James Bond villains. And I have somehow never seen a James Bond movie, so I didn't have as much of a reference point for this particular like set of villain tropes. And maybe I would have clicked with the book more if that had been more what I was expecting, and if that was more what I was prepared for. But yeah, I didn't end up connecting with this one as much as I was hoping to, even knowing that it's a comedy. So this one was kind of a dip in my reading enjoyment after the first one. Next up was The Bear and the Nightingale, and unfortunately this one kind of continued my trend of books that weren't quite what I was looking for in them, which I say with caution and hesitancy because I know a lot of people really love this book. And as a disclaimer, I had a very high fever while I was reading most of this book, and that usually doesn't help my enjoyment of books. But I think, again, I didn't come in with the most accurate expectations, again, largely on me. I knew that this was kind of historical fantasy, but I was thinking that it was mainly fairy tale retelling that happened to be in a historical setting, whereas I felt like it was primarily historical fiction that also happened to be kind of fantasy. And I think I would have been better set up for it if I'd known that going in, because I was really coming for the East of the Sun, West of the Moon retelling, and that part of the story really didn't come in until the last like 20 to 30% of the book. Most of the book was set up for that. And the other thing that I kind of came to the book for and was enjoying in the beginning was the family dynamics. And then I felt like after the first 30% or so of the book, the family wasn't spending as much time together. We weren't getting as much of the family dynamic. So, especially in that middle section of the book, we were just seeing a lot of things that I felt like this isn't what I came here to see. I also didn't really feel like the blend of the Russian Orthodox Church and the traditional Russian beliefs or folk tales or whatever made a lot of sense to me. So if you come to the book more for the historical Russian um, coverage of that era of history, and I did really appreciate the coverage of this era of Russian history back in the Middle Ages. I think it's 1400s is the time period that this is set in, and I definitely really appreciate seeing that time period and this area of the world having a story about it. I thought that that was really cool, but the things that happened within that setting were not primarily the things that I had come to the book to see. Next, however, I finished the Neverending Story, which might be my favorite book of these 9. I don't know. There were some really good ones in here, but this is definitely a contender for my favorite book of this month. Another one that you might see on my top 10 of the year list. Definitely going to be a contender for that because I just ended up absolutely really loving this book. In my fall library haul video, I had started this and said that it was off to a good start, and the good start never stopped, in my opinion. It is really interesting because the 80s movie of the Neverending Story, which is what most people know, only adapts the first half of the book. So it is weird to get to what does feel like a climax halfway through the book and then be like, what now? And I do think it's almost like a duology put into one volume. But I ended up being okay with that because I really liked both halves. They are very different, they're very distinct, but I didn't actually feel like the second half was any less boring. I felt like it should have been less boring because it didn't have that much plot until like halfway through the second half, but I didn't care because the stuff that was happening was so cool, and what was happening in the world, what was happening with the character, I was just totally absorbed, totally invested, and I could not have been happier with that section of the story, even if there wasn't technically a whole lot of plot going on at the moment. I just absolutely didn't care. I loved it. I I felt like this book actually feels like reading Narnia in some ways. There are so many books that say that they're like Narnia, but they usually don't feel as like deep as Narnia. But this is one where I was like, okay, this is a childhood book about a magical world that actually has that same sense of depth and symbolism to me that Narnia does, which I did not think I was ever going to find in any other book. So I would recommend this one like crazy. I was just amazed how profound it was for a children's book. There were so many things I was like, how is this in a children's book? It is like such a serious theme, and yet the book manages to still be fun at the same time. So I was all about this book. I can make a whole video about it. I could write essays about it. I was a bigger fan than I expected to be, even though I already loved the movie. So I am happy that this readathon encouraged me to read this faster than I would have otherwise. The next book I finished for the readathon is definitely the outlier of the group because it is not fantasy, it's sci-fi, and it's Earth Awakens, which is book 3 in the First Formic Wars series, which is a prequel series to Ender's Game. So you probably have heard of Ender's Game. You probably haven't heard of Earth Awakens, but I am a big fan of Ender's Game and a lot of the sequels to it, and now I'm in the prequels to it. There are so many spin-off books, and I actually ended up enjoying this book. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it because the first book in the series I had some mixed feelings about. The second one I probably liked a bit better, but still had some mixed feelings. But this one, surprisingly, I thought was the best of the series by far, and I ended up really enjoying it when I wasn't sure that I was going to. I didn't know how invested in the characters I was going to stay. I didn't know how good of a job it was going to do of wrapping up all the character stories, but I actually felt like things came together quite well, and I enjoyed seeing how the world became the world that we see in Ender's Game, which I don't always enjoy in prequel spin-offs. Sometimes I feel like it can be a little forced when they're explaining where this thing in the original story came from, but I actually ended up liking the explanations of where some of the world building elements in Ender's Game came from, like the International Fleet. Yeah, I ended up enjoying this more than I thought I would. The ending wasn't as resolved as I expected it to be, though. There is also the second Formic War series, but I thought that took place like a long time after this one, so I don't know if somewhere else those character stories are resolved more, I'll check out the Second Formic War and see if that's the case or not. So I was a little surprised by that. But overall, I enjoyed this one more than expected, and if you are a huge Ender's Game fan, then you will probably enjoy this prequel series. I know not everybody does, who is a fan of Ender's Game, but I ended up having a more positive experience with it than I thought I would. Next up is For the Wolf, which is basically what I wanted The Bear and the Nightingale to be, because it has that sort of similar fairy tale setup of the girl who is sent into the woods to be in some way sacrificed to the monster who lives in the woods, but then the monster turns out to not be quite as monstrous as everybody thought. So kind of a similar setup. But For the Wolf was like all about that premise, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale kind of got there at the end. So I ended up enjoying For the Wolf a lot more. At the beginning, I didn't know how I was going to feel about it because I felt like the main character was kind of the typical female protagonist who is rebellious and that's her only personality trait. But I enjoyed seeing as the story went on how she really seemed to mature and how she came to care about other people a lot more. There were times when she would like listen to what somebody said and make a different decision based on what somebody said, and I was like, did you just make a reasonable decision based on listening to somebody? Like, we don't usually see that from protagonists in books, so that would always get me excited. I ended up enjoying the romance in this, which I'm so picky about romance in books. I'm so very picky, but I appreciated that it was very based on them just taking care of each other, and it seemed overall very selfless, and so I appreciated that about it. I really liked the forest vibes, and I mean, she goes into the forest and stays in like a ruined castle that's half overgrown by moss and ivy and stuff, and there are trees everywhere, and there's this like little found family that lives out there in the forest, and they make each other tea and toast and stuff, and like how is that not supposed to be fun? So I really enjoyed that. I did find some of the magical backstory a little bit challenging to follow, of like what actually happened, who actually did what, why does this work the way it does. I'm sure that all of that is actually sufficiently explained in the book, but I did find it a bit hard to track with it, so maybe just be aware of that. But if you like fantasy that kind of crosses over between YA and adult, that is sort of based on fairy tales kind of, then this is likely something that you would enjoy. And next, I read yet another book with kind of a similar fairy tale premise to the one that I just talked about for The Bear and the Nightingale and For the Wolf, and also Naomi Novik and Catherine Arden endorse each other's books, you can see on the back cover. So like it's not just total coincidence that these two books are similar. Like the authors, it sounds like, are friends, and so I think that's really cool. I always like seeing authors collaborating, especially when they have similar books and they're like, hey, let's work together. So so I think it's really neat that Naomi Novik and Catherine Arden endorsed each other's books and that they wrote kind of similar books around the same time. This one ended up, of the three books, was sort of that similar fairy tale premise of girl gets sent into magical realm as kind of sacrifice to kind of monster slash leader of magical people. Like of the three books that I read with that rather specific thing in common, this one was in the middle for me. I liked For the Wolf a bit better. I liked this a bit better than The Bear and the Nightingale. But I ended up really enjoying this at the end. I felt like a good bit of the book felt slow to me. There were quite a few different POVs. It's basically the three stories of three different women, and so with all the different things that were going on, I felt like most of the book was just a bit slow paced. Not boring, because I was interested in what was going on, just it felt like it was taking quite a while for the things to happen. But then we got to the last like 25 to 30% of the story, and things definitely sped up a lot more and were getting really interesting, and I actually found myself like, oh man, I really want to keep reading to find out what happens next. So I thought that I was going to be less enthusiastic about this book than I ended up being, but the end totally redeemed it for me, and I see why so many people like this book a lot. So I did end up really enjoying it. It was a lot less of a Rumpelstiltskin retelling than I thought that it was going to be. I had heard that it was a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, and there's very little Rumpelstiltskin in it. I can definitely see some of the Rumpelstiltskin inspiration, but I would call it more inspired by Rumpelstiltskin than a retelling of it, because That plot is not really there, but in a way, the three different women who are the main characters are kind of different aspects of the Rumpelstiltskin story broken out into three people. So that was really interesting. I thought it was really interesting how the main character's Jewish culture was combined with the fantasy elements. I did enjoy how that was done, and I thought that that was pretty cool and pretty interesting to see in a fantasy novel like The Bear and the Nightingale. This one is kind of also historical fantasy, but this was a bit more what I was expecting from both of them. Of the historical situation is the backdrop, but the fantasy is the main thing. So basically what I'm saying is that I like this. I thought it was cool, it was unique, it was a little different from what I was expecting, but I ended up being happy with what it was. I also read The Princess Bride, which might make you think that I am like one of those crazy enthusiastic Princess Bride fans, but I actually didn't see it until I was 15, and I've only seen it all the way through like twice. So I'm not the person who has this entire movie memorized, but I wanted to read the book because that's how much of a book nerd I am, and I also love adaptations. I think adaptations are so fascinating. So I got the book. I was curious how different it was from the movie. I feel like I had heard that the book was different from the movie, but it is actually so similar. Like, it's almost verbatim. This could be the novelization of the film. Basically, the only difference is that some things from the book were cut out from the movie, which absolutely always happens, but there was nothing like really significant or surprising from the book that was cut out for the movie. So I was just surprised it was so similar because I felt like I had heard that it was different. The main thing that is different is the frame story, where in the movie you have the very simple frame story about the little boy who's sick and his grandpa reads him the story, whereas in the book the frame story is a lot more complicated, where the author William Goldman is supposed to be that little boy, but it was his dad reading him the story, and then when William Goldman grew up, he adapted that story that his dad had read to him as a kid, and there are lots of notes from the author throughout the story telling where he cut stuff out of the original and how he's summarizing things from the original, and he'll put in asides about what his experience as a little boy was like when his dad was reading him this story. So the movie gives a kind of similar experience when it cuts back to the little boy and the grandpa, but there's just a lot more of that, and it feels like a much bigger part of the actual story of The Princess Bride in the book than it does in the movie. So that was interesting. I always felt like I liked the movie, but I wasn't as enthusiastic about it as other people. But I think reading the book has made me like the movie a lot more also, and just like the story more in general. And especially in the book, I think it has some deeper themes than people sometimes appreciate, which would be interesting to talk or write more about sometime. But yeah, I ended up actually really enjoying the Book of the Princess Bride. I feel like not many people like the book of it, which is interesting. I would love to hear some explanations about what people don't like about the Book of the Princess Bride, because to me it seems like just the movie, but as a book. So that one is interesting to me, and I would love to hear more about other people's opinions. And last but not least, I have been reading Voice of the Future Volume 3, Stories of Healing and Home, and I have not actually finished it quite yet. I have one more story to go, but I do think I will finish that today. So this has been fun to read for a readathon, because these are stories written by my friends in the Author Conservatory, and they each wrote these short stories as a capstone project for their time in the Author Conservatory. And they worked together to publish the book, and so it's been really fun to get to read my copy of it. And I had heard about a lot of these stories before they were published. I was even a critique partner for one of them, so just seeing their final forms has been a lot of fun, and seeing how these writers have grown over the years that I've known them. I've really enjoyed that a lot. The book came with a hand-painted bookmark from one of the authors, Ryan Elizabeth. So yeah, that's just been a whole lot of fun to read, and check out all the different short stories. It's been nice in the middle of all these long books to have some more short form things to read. That's been a really nice way to break up the longer reading, and I am looking forward to reading the last story in this, hopefully later today. So that is my readathon wrap up. It's been kind of a whirlwind. It's been a little bit crazy, but it's fun to read so many books with so many other people who love reading books. And I'm glad that I found out about this readathon, and grateful to the people who have put a lot of time into running it and making it happen. And I would definitely consider doing this again in the future. Probably not right away. I think I need a bit of a break, but in the future I could definitely see myself doing another one of these, and hopefully knowing a bit better when I go in how to strategize my reading and be a little bit more oriented when I get started. Let me know if you would like to hear more about any of these books that I mentioned, or if you would like to hear more about what it was like to be in a readathon, or if you have any really good readathons to recommend. I would also love to hear about that. Thank you guys for journeying with me. Bye!